Is it so much to ask having a sandwich named after me, or a building, a tall, gleaming tower, or a bridge with a noble brow and a half dozen suicides? Back to the sandwich. It could be introduced to the public by a turtle wearing a top hat and tails, and a cat with a clarinet and licorice tail. You know how I am, fanciful but simple in my taste, yearning for what is original, reaching for the grand. If all the sandwiches and buildings and bridges are taken, it could be a forest preserve. Mountains rise, shadowed and misty, and the surrounding trees stand thickly, territorial briars prickly. Can you picture it? But I'd rather have the sandwich, something good with soup, seedless rye with a thin layer of mixed mayonnaise and Dijon mustard, spread all the way out to the crust, or maybe with pesto, but definitely with bacon and turkey, so that I'll have a reason and not an excuse when I drift off after our long conversation. Alas, no sandwich, no monument can compensate for everything I leave undone: peace treaties and climate accords, clothing the naked, housing the dispossessed, the return of traditional American values, 60 cent a gallon gasoline and cigarettes at 50 cents a pack. No sandwich can let the legless walk or the fearful run again, reverse the course of rivers, or give the horseshoe crab time to evolve. And in this soured age, who is there to ask to make it so? Is it too much to ask? A poem in the book I Hear It the Way I Want to Be by David Kozinski, who is our guest this evening. Good evening. My
Good
name
evening.
is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaboration between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCam. The focus of our program is to give our listeners and our viewers the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia and its surrounding area. So tonight we have a poet who is very beloved in Philadelphia and who has shown a lot of love for poetry, and that's David P. Kozinski. David has two full length books of poems: the original manuscript of I Hear It the Way I Want It to Be, which was published in 2022. It was a finalist for the Inlandia, California Institute's Hillary Gravedike, Graven Dyke Prize, and Tripping Over Memorial Day was published in 2017, both by Kelsey Books. David's chapbook, Loopholes, published by Broadkill Press, won the Dogfish Head Poetry Prize. David is the poet in residence at Rockwood Park and Museum in Newcastle County, Delaware, and is arts editor for Schuylkill Valley Journal. Delaware Today magazine will feature David in October. He was the 2018 established Professional Poetry Fellowship recipient from the Delaware Division of the Arts. That year, he was named Mentor of the Year by Expressive Path, a nonprofit that fosters arts participation for youth in Montgomery County and Philadelphia. Publications by David have recently appeared in One Art, Dream Streets, North of Oxford, and forthcoming in Unoya Review. So, welcome, David. It's really great to have you on our Philly Loves Poetry. I wanted to start, our discussion, David, and looking back at the poem I just read. Let me get it again. And it was something that you mentioned in there that I found very interesting. Yes, it was that third stanza. You know how I am, fanciful but simple in my taste, yearning for what is original, reaching for the grand. So is that you, David? Is that a kind of a summary that you see of your style?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and good good evening to you. Appreciate your having me on. Uh, I would say it's a slightly self-deprecating um, vision of myself. Uh, I mean, that's what I might aspire to, but whether that whether the aspiration is reached or not, I guess is somebody else's judgment to make.
Well, I think it in after reading your work, and both in this, I hear it the way I want to be, and then your other chapbook, Loopholes. I think that's, I mean, as far as your style of writing, it is because the grand part of it is definitely because um, you really have an affection for the lushness of the English language. And uh, I've seen that not only in what your poems, I've read of your poems, but I've been at readings where you have read poems. And it's one thing that I've always walked away from in thinking about you, or it's like a characterization, is that really this very strong affection and also demonstration of the language. And so I wanted to begin also by talking about that, and because that seems to be a hallmark of your poetry.
Yeah, I would like to celebrate language in my writing, and would hope that other people would come to enjoy it at least to some degree the way I do. I mean, I think it's a beautiful gift that we're given, however you believe we come to it, evolution or otherwise. But I think it's a tremendous thing, and it's something that can be both wonderfully used and horribly abused.
Hmm. Well, how was that nurtured in you? I mean, in reading your books, you've had a very wide exposure, surely beyond Philadelphia. You've lived in a foreign country. You've seen a lot, and I mean, the environment, as I understand it, that you were raised in, with your father and your mother, who were arts focused, as well as it seems your brother, that and you yourself, a painter, that seems that that was a great environment to be able to nurture language. That language was really something that was recognized and honored.
Yes, definitely. My really come from a musical family. My family were a bunch of musicians and teachers, um, but they also appreciated the other art forms as well. We, spent a fair amount of time at the what is now called the Delaware Art Museum, and some other museums in the area. So I did get an appreciation for visual art, and of course, along with all this was, it was presumed that one should be able to write and speak about whatever he was interested in. So I got a fairly good grounding in I think in English, just in grade school and high school. Went to a private school here in Wilmington called Tower Hill,
Hmm.
which did a good job with that. But again, my dad wrote music reviews for the Wilmington Evening Journal back when I was growing up, and one of the things we would sometimes do is he'd write the review at night, having gone to a concert, and then in the morning we would take a look at it and proofread it for him, and then take it to the newspaper office on the way into school and drop it off there.
Uh-huh.
It was, this was all paper copy in those days.
Yes. Yeah. So very much there. So the book of your poems is extremely interesting and diverse because there are so many experiences in your life that you invite uh, people to experience. Um, and there was a poem that I read in here, and I have a habit of doing this. I think I did it when I was reading J.C. Todd's book, and and other poets that I've had on the program. There's one or two poems that you kind of trigger something in me as and unlocks in me, other things in the book, and that it is the poem "Find and Seek." And uh, I was particularly the way you approach it. I call out for you, and you are there for me. But also this line in there: there are more rooms in our house than I know. Each door opens to another room, and I really felt, as going back and reading the book a second time, I really looked at your poems as rooms opening up, about stories and different stories, that you're inviting your reader to experience. And I found that, really fascinating. And is that somewhat accurate rendering of your intentions?
Yes, I'd say there's actually kind of an interesting metaphor that could be at work here, which is that the book itself is kind of like a neighborhood of houses or a house with a bunch of rooms in it, or you could use whatever metaphor you like, but I think that's a good one. It's like a house with many rooms in it, and you can sort of walk by reading the book. You can walk from one to another and take a look around. I also sort of see that in a way as kind of a metaphor for the mind itself. It's a house with many different rooms, and sometimes we don't even know how many we have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also found it, interesting. It's funny about titles of books. You know, I see titles of books and I scratch my head after I've gotten in the book, and I look back and I look at the title, and I really don't see how that connects. But it was, with J.C. Todd's book last month. It was very evident how the title of the book connected to the content and the poems, and I see that with yours. But I mean, I think it's a very interesting thing. I hear it the way I want it to be. Some people say, oh, well, I see it the way I want it to be. And so I wanted you to talk about your selection of that as your title, and more of a reflection, on this collection of poems.
Well, it comes from, it's the title of one of the poems in the book.
Yeah.
And I wanted to choose a title that was interesting sounding and could get some attention. But also, I wanted to choose that particular poem as the title poem because there's some humor in it. I would like it if people, read my book or read some of the poems or heard them and didn't feel that they were entirely somber and lugubrious and brooding, but that there's humor interwoven in them. Uh, the the actual title, I hear it the way I want it to be, is I mean, there's a bit of irony in almost everything that I write. I was just recently was giving a talk and remembered that one of my great French teacher back in high school used to say, "If it is not precise, it is not French," meaning the language itself. And that sort of spurred me to think, well, being Slavic, of somewhat Slavic origin myself, I thought to say, well, if it is not ironic, it is probably not Slavic. There, I mean, indeed, I think we all hear it the way we want it to be at some time or another. Whether that's a good thing or not is possibly depends on the situation.
Hmm. I call them these little mysteries or these stories that you invite people into. Um, it's almost like you invite people to see it as they want to see it, you know, rather than this is not a factual. Necessarily, it is factual, but it doesn't necessarily have to be factual to enjoy the poem. And I imagine you take some liberties, with that, in building a poem.
quite a bit. I mean, a lot of the bits and pieces of material that find their way into the poems come from my life experience, of course. But uh, I do feel that if you want to stick to the facts, probably best to write journalism or to write biography or something that is fact oriented. And that if you're writing poetry, it's sticking to the facts is not the main focus. You want to create the best poem you can. And if that means changing the color of the towels in the room rather than the ones that were actually in the room you're thinking about when you're writing, if it works better if they were chartreuse rather than white or blue or green, then you make them chartreuse because chartreuse sounds better in this poem.
Uh-huh. I had a professor in college. He was a history professor, and he really took exception with anyone who would say, well, it's a matter of facts. And he says there is no matter in facts. Facts are ever changing. It depends on what your perspective is, who you are, maybe even what class you come from, what education you have, what social group, etc. So that's a long-winded way of saying that in your retelling of many of these episodes in your life, is there that these things are changing, they're dynamic, and you change them as you want to change them to build the poem, not to sensationalize. I don't mean that, but perspective, and looking back over our life and how we pick and choose to talk about and relate to things is very different. It's not a matter. It's not necessarily a matter of facts.
Right, right. Certainly, people perceive the same facts, if you want, if we can use that word, differently. I guess I think of facts as just things that we, for in part for reasons of convenience, can agree on. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you and I are sitting in our separate homes, but are being broadcast over the internet and over the TV. So those are things that actually are happening. Now, I could write a poem that starts out about being interviewed by Charles Carr. Now, whether I stuck to exactly what was going on in this interview would be up for interpretation, up for making decisions as the poem begins to shape itself.
Mm-hmm. In something you sent to me before when we were talking about your, the discussion, and you indicated that poetry is fiction, and of course, yeah, okay, it is fiction. But the fact that you drilled down on that, can you discuss that?
Yeah, I think for me anyway, like what I was talking about before, if you want to write factually, if you want to stick to the facts, probably best to do journalism or history or something else. But with poetry, I think one of the great things about it is that we can take some liberties. That old phrase, poetic license, is meaningful. Certainly, there are poems that stick to something that happened in history or something that happened to the poet, but the poet is always speaking through a narrator. The poem is always coming through the voice of a narrator, whether that voice is extremely close to what the poet sounds like or whether it's quite different. I mean, sometimes there's a big chasm between the speaker of the poem and the poet. For example, if one writes with a unreliable narrator, a narrator who is either not remembering things accurately or is maybe not uh, in possession of all his faculties, or is flat out lying to the reader or the listener, or intersperses some bits of truth with some fantasy, some fabulism. Uh, then all those things make for a different kind of feeling. I mean, sometimes I do write very directly based on something that happened because it was such an interesting experience to me that I can kind of stick to it pretty closely and just try to describe it. But Most of the time, I would say I'm trying to find something else besides what just some little anecdote from my own life.
Hmm. What do you read, and what's uh, influences, or you feel it influences your your poetry? I saw one interview where somebody characterized you as a language poet, and I see that, but I don't blanketly put that title on you. And sometimes I really don't like titles on poets, because then it can become a straitjacket in a way. Yes, I see there are elements of the language poet, but I also see something different, so something much broader. So how would you characterize your poetry if it's to be called a school of poetry or a style of poetry?
Well, I'd say I would certainly uh, have something in common with the so-called language poets. I mean, there is a school
Hmm.
of writers who call themselves language poets, or have been called that. Um, uh, at one point, I was actually in a critique group that was called Langpo, and our aim was to try to write language poetry. It was trying, and I wanted to do that because I felt I had kind of gotten into a little bit of a rut and wanted to try to expand my horizons and my approach. Um, I think you could call me a language poet in the sense that often I start with language and then find the meaning in it as I go along in the writing, rather than setting out to write a specific like description of an anecdote or something like that. And then knowing what I'm going to say ahead of time. I usually don't. I start with a phrase or some idea or something I've heard somebody else say, and just let it take me where it will.
Hmm.
But
Uh,
with a great deal of emphasis on the sound and the rhythm of the words.
okay. Um, who would you say, I mean, in the genre of poetry that has influenced your writing?
Well, I think for one, going back a long way, when I was a teenager, was James Dickey. Both his poetry and his novels. Deliverance is his most famous work, that was made into a movie, but it's a wonderful novel. The novel actually reads like poetry to me. Um, there are other novelists who I think write in almost in poetry. There's a novel by Cormac McCarthy called The Road. To me, it's like written in poetry, in an unusual voice. But as far as poets go, I think like you can think of Wallace Stevens as another. Certainly W.H. Auden. And then lesser known people have influenced me a lot. People that I think are every bit as good. We have right here in the Philadelphia area, every bit as good as some of the more people who are more famous in the poetry community. Anyway, whenever I
Mm.
say famous poet, people sometimes laugh because, well, how many famous poets really are there in terms of we're not as none of us are as famous as the least famous basketball player probably.
Mm. Well, I have to agree with you. There are some tremendous. I mean, this show is proof of the pudding. I mean, some of the poets that I've had on this show, nobody can deny that they are outstanding poets, and they don't need the national recognition. Although some of them absolutely have national recognition, but I believe that Philadelphia and Philadelphia area is just has such a great community, art community in poetry. So, and I mean, you're part of it very much in terms of the Schuylkill Valley Journal, the Roxborough Art Center. You're an artist yourself, so I think that's really very fascinating, and it's I just I feel very lucky that I'm like at a crossroads of being able to have these wonderful poets on, including yourself, on this program to talk about their poem, how what their poetry is about, how they arrive at it, what's behind it, and then of course to read their poetry. So it's it's very fascinating also, and I don't know if we have as much time. Is that you are a painter, you are an artist, and when one reads your poems, you see that painterly quality, that attention to detail. Do you see that intersection between you as a painter and you as a poet? Because I've interviewed some painters and they've really said, well, not really. I don't have that. There's like kind of separate lives, but sometimes somebody jolts me to say, yeah, I guess there is an intersection between me as a painter and me as a poet.
For me, I feel that there is. Now, like, trying to explain what that intersection is to other people is not the easiest thing to do. But there are ways in which, to me, the kind of visual art that I make is very much related or comes from the same place as the poetry and other writing that I've done, but particularly the poetry. There's a fluidity about the creation of visual art, at least the way I go about it, that is very similar in the process to the fluidity that I find when I'm trying to make a good poem. The another thing is that one of the pieces of advice that we often hear for poets is show more than you tell. In other words, don't just tell me something was beautiful. Show me why it was beautiful. Show me paint me a picture with the language. So there's that crossover as well.
And you see that very much in the quality of your work. So, but it's great to have this discussion, but it's also a great part of the program when we turn uh, the screen and the microphone over to our poets to read their poems. And I want to do that at this time, David, and that our audience can savor some of your poems.
Thank you, Charles. I don't like to do a lot of preamble, but I think maybe just a little bit of explanation
Sure.
about the way this book is put together would be appropriate. There are three sections of the book. The middle section is one longish poem that is an elegy to my brother, who was my only blood sibling. He died in December of 2014. And at that time, it fell to me to give a eulogy at a memorial service that was held at the church that he and I went to when we were kids growing up. And not long after delivering that eulogy, I started to write this elegy. And the elegy, in some ways, addresses the eulogy, or it interweaves the eulogy into the poem. My brother was a professional musician, multi-talented professional musician, composer, conductor, arranger, voice coach, teacher, and actually a very fine pianist and a very fine organist as well. He performed with the Boston Pops as a soloist on the piano and played some of the great pipe organs of the world, including Longwood Gardens, which is one of the great ones. So in any event, this middle section is one long poem, and it's divided into four parts. And I'm going to read the second part of it, which is about a page. But the title of the poem is Now You Will Be Ashes, Our Conversation Starts. And this is the second part. Now I carry the 4 pages to the lectern and revisit passages from our long ago, when I followed you like a fan, trains to Princeton Junction, to Gare de Lyon, Chelsea, airplanes to Spokane, Hanover, Dessau. The church is still adorned like rich people's Christmas, where you presided at the organ, where mothers' voices rang out from under veiled hats. Remember those? I can see the girl in pale lip gloss, nipples probing unexplored space. She sang with her new hatched chest thrust out. For me and the boys, we thought. I should know better now. She sang of her 13 springs, of her body's modest blooming, and the God is love safety surrounding us. I start to read a eulogy, written in one night. You've gone so fast there wasn't time to compose. I don't begin once upon a time, but I admitted the typing fairy that cobbled me a pair of uneven legs while I slept. I do it differently now, like in almost everything. Unlike all the haphazard choices, the friends who stayed turned out well. Every kneeling pad is needle-pointed with an icon, a fish, 3 crowns, a cross, and we stand up and sit down a few times, mouthing old words, familiar rhythms. They pack us in pews as young sardines, these institutions. Tabulae rasae, thirsty minds accept faulty explanations that drip, drip, drip until they must be true. Overnight, we changed the number of the year, something broken arriving from overseas in a polished ebony box. So that was from the middle section of the book, and I'm going to move forward to the third section. The poems in the third section, loosely speaking, deal with things that I was thinking about and things that were on my mind after my brother died. It's very loose, however. The first section of the book has more to do with things that happened before that time. So I'm going to read the first poem from this last section, the section that sort of deals with things that happened or things that were on my mind after he died. And this is titled, Tear Them Off One at a Time. It still isn't clear what was to come next. There was a plot, but even dreams changed. Sweat-damp pajamas and a bank of red telephones rang as often as I slept. There were no easy days. Even if someone steered, the cigar wasn't going to smoke itself, or the lamps keep themselves trimmed and burning. They scraped one brother's lung right here at home, took another's leg. Mr. Best of Bremen offered tolling bells as he handed off the urn to bring the other brother home with the suitcases. I can't move my hands enough to rake a campus for ideas that sound original, to cover futility with earth. The days are torn away. So in the poem, there's a reference to 2 other brothers. They're not blood brothers, but they are friends who were so close that I feel as if they were brothers. I have a number of brothers and sisters in my extended family. These 2 that were mentioned in this book were part of a foursome of a tennis foursome that we had for more than 10 years. And unfortunately, one of the fellows is no longer with us, and another one had a terrible accident and lost a leg. In any event, very, very fond memory, very fond thoughts of them both. And here's another poem from this third and final section of the book titled Standing Still. About the time I recognize it, love ebbs, leaving a cleansed sand and polished glass, a cast of starfish and urchins. Coping with loss flows one way for mother, another for father, nowhere with brother and sister. There are some I should not have survived, and many more I will not, open-mouthed throng. Suggestions become guidelines, and then thick rules of thumb harden into laws. It's not that I expect everything to stand still, but I've thumbed my nose sore at good advice and jarred the rest like preserves. Paralyzed when we dream deeply, it's harder to fall from high limbs should we find ourselves chasing or chased, bending to pick summer's berries or pull bones from the fire. That this inaction persists into waking is not excused but explained. Hobbled instinct, spurred decisions cost me strength and peace and what they can buy. The children long to be listened to, and I would oblige them, standing to receive and record what they cry out, pronouncing the syllables back to them. It is the deadliest game we are playing, and there is no catching them near the cliffs or fetching them from chasms, even if they wish to be returned. They are starving, big as they are. So a few themes or motifs, perhaps I would be better off saying, repeat themselves in these poems. I guess maybe I'll read one more from the third section of the book, and then move to some of from the beginning, the first part. This is titled Arrivals, Departures. The woman I don't recognize, except in the glitter and ruins of dreamland, looks a little like Diana Krall. Tells me her father died, not when or how, and I wrap my rough hand over hers the way paper overcomes rock, the way overcoming can shield and heal, and say in the commonest way, I don't have words for moments like this. As if the two are related, she adds, I was born at the airport. Maybe she means came into the world with baggage. Maybe she means people only pause in transit. I summon a look of understanding to my eyes and lay my hand flat on the table parallel to hers so that together they shape something winged, at rest, contemplating flight. Just a little side bit. Diana Krall is mentioned in the poem. She's a very wonderful jazz singer. And one of the people I was thinking of when writing this poem was a cousin of my wife's, who is a wonderful singer herself. But anyway, if I may, I'll move on to the, unless you have some further question or comment, I'll move on to some poems from the earlier in the book.
Okay.
When I was growing up, we had, when I was a little kid, we had an upright acrosonic piano in our living room, and my father and my brother and one of my uncles and sometimes one of my aunts would play chamber music, would play quartets and trios and such right in the living room. And then as my brother got a bit more accomplished on the piano, they purchased a sort of a grand piano, not a huge concert grand, but not a little baby grand either. And that's mentioned in this poem. Actually, this poem is pretty much all about it. It's titled Baldwin, 1974. With my brother studying abroad, the bigger than baby, smaller than concert grand that dominated my parents' living room like a tuned up, polished vehicle was mine to bang on, to experiment with. The lid raised, the cage of metal cords plucked with tongs or tapped with a socket wrench. I laid paper of varying hefts across the strings of the top octaves for percussion, a wooden ruler across the bottom, Hung the old Sony reel-to-reels microphone like a trouble light under the hood. We made tapes of everything in our teens, the bathtub running, dog barking, vacuum cleaner, and cello duets, the mantel clock chiming Westminster, Wittenberg, and Winchester, running things faster and slower, backwards and mashed all together. This was the field he'd play on, the one my father put us out in early, the one my family approved, where Stefan thrived and I fooled around. I played a little baseball and loved football, relishing concussion in helmet and pads, scaring mother, I knew, without her saying so. But seated in the cockpit of the Baldwin or the Steinway at school, power under my hands, the smooth, flat white keys and the candy bar black ones at my fingers choosing, I could drive the girls crazy, I thought. Suzanne did sit still now and then in the auditorium, her loafers kicked off, rocking a leg crossed over a knee, as my fingers mounted the steps of a scale, urging her along with my left hand. During the late 1980s and early 90s, my brother was the associate conductor of the Spokane Symphony out in Washington State. And I visited there a couple of times. So this poem borrows little bits and pieces from that trip and also from a trip to New England that my then girlfriend, now wife, took in the mid-90s. I think it was 1995. It was the year Jerry Garcia died, in any case. I think that was 95, the same summer. But then again, poetry is fiction, so it's taking bits and pieces from life experience and kind of making a collage of them. The poem is titled Black Cat Bone, and there's an epigraph from Jimi Hendrix, "'Cause I'm a voodoo child." Black cat bone. Big houses turn me on. Under the table in her denim skirt and dark tights, she owns a cat's slow, silent moves and lips that set my whistle for a long ride on a whipsaw road. In the great room at the Breakers, we take stately breakfasts. Lots of slippery surfaces and rubber meets the road at a canter. Sunlight strains through doors that open on pulsing masts and stunted grass, the sighing sails that wring most of the hoodoo from my hands and leave the bitter bone. We had trust and a future that opened like a hatbox and sounded like a bass drum. Took our time at New Year's brunch at the brightest hotel in Spokane. Half the people in Tabby's hometown, so far from anywhere else, knew I was turning 35 before I heard their names. Her hair grew back wild from the chemo, the color of bourbon and smoke. Her arms, silky in their ebony opera gloves, held and pulled me like a tide before her nails opened gashes that stranded us on an unfamiliar shore. And again, here's one that borrows from life events, but certainly changes details and mashes things all together, as you might have noticed was a line in one of the poems a minute ago. There's a reference in here to mourning a young poet, and that is something that was going on when I was writing this a few years ago. someone that we lost much too young, named Elizabeth Leo. And in fact, there's one of the poems in this book has an epigraph from one of her poems. But this is not that one. This is titled October Arrives in Sycamore Gold and Oak Bark Black. A long summer ends with forsythia tinted rose, then plum, a dying pear tree, and freight trains knocking the window panes. The tracks etch an incision scar along the river, and some nights the wind pulls the essence of garbage dump and holds it over this part of town. It chokes like a queen of clubs that drops on the last trick you needed. My long summer ends with mourning a young poet and a dislocated shoulder. The august Dr. Nuts and Bolts shuffles in, glances at it, says, "You have two choices," and describes the surgery. What's the other choice? Don't operate and your arm becomes a decorative thing hanging from your shoulder. A year ends with much to look toward, though this may seem like looking in a mirror that faces a mirror, and to look back on in lights that pierce night's dome. Clove and bay leaf in the kindergarten, vanilla extract dribbled into warm milk when I couldn't sleep. Numbing water sliding over stones to the river that would not be dammed even long enough to remember the loved and gone. A voice that speaks only from the page of landing at inhospitable ports and about fire escapes and steep embankments. It ends as I lift my arm to wave to the woman who can laugh with me when there isn't much to laugh about. Maybe I'll read one more from the third part of the book and then come back to the beginning a little bit more. This poem is, in a way, addressing the process of writing a manuscript, composing a manuscript for a book of poems. It's a more difficult task than I thought it would be. I've done it 3 times now, and it's really hard to know exactly what the right order is going to be. It's almost like composing a poem itself or writing a poem itself, but it's sort of a more complicated affair in a way. So that's a little bit of what this is about. It's called I Would Sleep Through Busy Days. This book has been writing itself. I mean it. My keypad taps away while I snooze. The manuscript strides handsomely and truly toward its ending, flexing panther's muscles. A dry cough admonishes we avoid making overtures or indulging in recapitulations, even with the supply of music drying up like dying rivers. The tapping continues anyway. Nothing peripheral or centrifugal, please, from that self-same voice. I say, rulers are meant to be snapped in half over a hard knee or picked off by lone men posted in cheering crowds. Tap, tap, tap. I'm winded after a few stares, but the book runs a half marathon and looks ready to strip its cover off and take a long swim. Will my volume end its days bedridden and worm-eaten, I think aloud, in the pet products, cleaning supplies, and paper goods aisle of the smallest supermarket in Newcastle County? Could a book watch too many Aquaman cartoons for its own good? Of course it could. It did. It may not be taken for long as a good book, but for now it is an apt pupil, the William Tell Apple, the best new show of a slow season. It is the call of crows that land awkwardly on a shaggy green lawn on a sumptuous spring morning, when dogs bark the news back and forth between the houses of neighbors who haven't much time for pleasure reading.
You make mention of, uh, you sat down. This poem essentially wrote itself, and that's really not that far fetched. I had an interview and I had a guest, Paul Muldoon, the famous Irish poet, and I read an interview that he gave, and he says, I don't write any of my poems; they write themselves. And he gave a very interesting, long explanation, for that, in about a force uh, that creates these poems. It's almost like if we sit patiently, poems do come to us, and poems begin to write themselves, and it's almost like there is another force at work here. So I was thinking of that when you mentioned that, and people have to realize that that's not something's quirky. I think we all experience that. You know, Sometimes when I have an idea to write a poem, and it ends up going completely different. I said, that's not what I intended. Almost like I'm talking to this omniscient, whoever it is, muse or whatever, and it goes. So it's very telling to say that. I think a lot of poets experience that.
Absolutely. I think over and over again, I hear many different poets have said, I don't even know where this came from. I don't know how I got this idea. It just came to me. I started writing it, and then I started revising it, and I revised it some more. And
Right.
of course, you shape what's
Sure.
come.
Sure.
But I think I understand what Muldoon means. It's like being in the zone, as they say. If you're a great athlete, I think
Mm-hmm.
often those guys are almost operating on autopilot. They're not
Right.
consciously. They couldn't possibly consciously think about everything you do when you're dribbling and shooting a basketball from
Mm-hmm.
30 feet out or whatever. And B.J. Ward, the a poet I really admire and enjoy, he put it. I think he was quoting somebody else. I can't remember who he was quoting, but he said the poet should be like the sleeve that the poem passes through.
Hmm.
And
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think it's a wonderful saying. It's a wonderful
So
quote.
I agree. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
We
that's
want to continue to hear your poems.
well. Looks like we have time for at least two or three
Mm-hmm.
more. Maybe two short ones and one medium one. How's that? I'll just read one of the shorter ones from this third section called Heavy, Heavy Metal. You finally find your row and your seat, looking forward to a night that lifts and bounces, that stickily edges you when it can to its or anyone's full body tease, unmasked, at ease. What remains is fog hanging like crepe, unsupported, willows billowing. And just like that, the re-humpty-dumptification of the egg industry and other slight miracles are accomplished. And release comes at the end of a chain of trumpets and trombones, which is to say it's brassy, sounds it, feels it, even tastes it. The saliva drips thinly from the clarinet's bell, and the chimes and lyre stir a rue of Black Sabbath. That one was published in One Art magazine. It's an online poetry magazine that my friend Mark Tanowski started a while back. And let's see. Maybe I'll just read the one more, and I'll read the title poem. I hear it the way I want it to be, and that can be the conclusion for me. I hear it the way I want it to be. Back in sixth grade, as we smoked in Rockford Park, Chris joked about the blacking factory where Dickens worked as a child. I thought he meant the Black King factory, where day after bleak 19th century day, boys our age toiled to produce one weak but essential chess piece after another, their grimy fingernails worn down, pale faces set grimly, determined to make each cut perfectly and faster than the last time. It seemed a natural empire accrued through the digits of underfed tykes, carving pawns and castles and pointy-hatted clergymen from nuggets of ebony, while over at the White King factory, their counterparts worked elephant tusks, all for export, all over the earth. It was hard and cruel, but at least they were making something someone would use for fun. I knew I should feel grateful we spent our days learning fractions and how the map of Europe changed so often. I knew we were coddled and soft and not like those boys who lost parts of their fingers to machines, as my granddad had some long time ago. But from somewhere far above and not too far in the future, I felt the squeeze coming to manufacture a more amusing game, a better strategy for knocking down kings.
Wow. Well,
Thank you very
David,
much.
yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been a terrific discussion and a terrific reading of your poems. I think you gave us an outstanding sample of the poems in this book at all levels. I have to say also, and I think I said that to you, the poem about your brother is absolutely gorgeous. It really is, and it captures this richness of your language, and of course your deep affection for your brother, and it gives the reader really an opportunity to understand him and know him, and I think that's a great compliment to the poem. So I thank you very much, and of course I thank our technical director Ileana Pineda for making this all happen, and to PhillyCam, our sponsor, for making it happen. Lastly, I want to say, and as I say on every show, is this is just one program that is sponsored by and produced by the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia. I mean, every week there is a poetry event that is sponsored by the Moonstone Art Center. And there are anthologies that are being produced. There are new chapbooks of poets in Philadelphia and elsewhere that are being published. And I say this, and I've said it a number of times, that in any year now, Moonstone Arts sponsors 100 poetry events and embraces close to 300 poets, not only from Philadelphia, but now even internationally. So what I want to say is Moonstone needs your support. And you can go to our website and you can figure out a way that you can support us to continue this mission that Larry has started close to 40 years ago. And it continues on and on and on. And Larry's pretty much a one-man show. He completely fascinates me that he has the energy and the vitality to keep this rolling along. And I can see why. I mean, in Philadelphia, as I say, there is a rich culture of poetry in this city, and it just keeps growing week after week, year after year. So I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate the support. And again, thank you very much, David, for the time that you have given us.
Thank you.